Welcome back, everyone, to Asset Horizon on Zer0 Books and Repeater Media. And today with us, we have the privilege of having Colin Drumm, who is an independent scholar and an organizer at the Mimbres School. Colin organizes classes, reading groups, and so forth in an online Discord community. And one of the reasons that we wanted to have him on was to talk about some overlapping opinions that we might share with Colin regarding para-academia and the university and what the university is like today under neoliberalism and some of the challenges and obstacles all of that entails. So Colin, welcome on the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And I'd like you to give your proper introduction. What is it that you do? How did you get involved with the Mimbres School? And what is your basic take on academia today?
Sure. So I spent 10 years at the University of California. I was in the English department at UC Riverside for a couple years, and then I went to the History of Consciousness program at UC Santa Cruz. So my intellectual work, my scholarly work is about monetary history, which we'll probably get to, I assume. I've been trying my dissertation, which is going to become a book at some point. I'm writing a new chapter for it, so we'll see how long that takes me. But is an attempt to intervene into monetary debates that I'm sure your viewers are kind of aware of, MMT associated things. Where does money come from? Can the government run out of it? What does all this mean? And there's been, kind of on the left over the last 10 years, there's been sort of a simmering debate between Marxists and MMT people about this question, because raising the question of money, what is money, presents a kind of challenge to the value theory that Marxism is based on, and so this has been a fairly contentious debate. My intervention into it is to say that they're essentially both wrong, and that we need to rethink. There's an exciting opportunity to think about what money is and the history of it that is not being pursued because the debate has been divided into these kind of two camps, and everybody seems to be kind of committed to one or the other, and thinking in the middle between them is not something that a task that many have taken up. So that's what my scholarly work is about. I spent 10 years at the University of California, and particularly at Santa Cruz, which is one of the most unfortunate places to do your PhD in terms of finances of making it work. Studio apartments in Santa Cruz cost a lot more than the money that they give you that is supposed to support your whole life, not just your rent, right? So more than 100% of my income was going to my rent, and there was various labor actions. There was a wildcat strike that people I'm sure familiar with, that I was kind of involved in a little bit, and but I, through these experiences, have become somewhat pessimistic about the university, the prospects for asserting power in the university to make the university serve the needs of students and intellectuals, which to my mind is what it should do, but I'm not sure it's going to. And so I've been looking for other alternatives. And what we're now calling Mimbres School really began as just a seminar that I started giving. I had developed a kind of following on Facebook of people, posting about my research and various thoughts about other things. And I had developed a following, and I said, well, why don't I give a class? And this turned, there was a lot of, I made some money doing it. It turned into a nice little side gig that, I didn't have to apply for grants and stuff to fund my way through university because I was doing Patreon instead. And so I've been doing that for about maybe a little bit more than 3 or 4 years. And basically, people showed up to my seminar, and I said, well, these people have a lot to offer. So why don't I give some of them a turn at leading the class? Jade DeLille is the notable person here she really showed up in my seminar and changed my thinking about a lot of things in particular. So if we get to the money stuff, money has something deep to do with problems about kinship, about human kinship, in a way that is not thought about at all, basically, by the way that either Marxists or liberals or chartalists or whatever think about it. It's a deep problem. And that's something that Jade really expanded my thinking on. And so basically the Mimbres School grew out of my seminar, where I wanted to play teacher play student in addition to playing teacher. And so, so we've now been So last year was kind of the first full year of doing Mimbres School, where I was doing it for full time because I finished my PhD and basically decided that I did not want to continue with academia. I had my fill of it. It wasn't giving me what I wanted, and I was having much more fun hanging out with my friends at Mimbres School. And so we offer about, we're going to offer, I think it's 13 classes this year. They're 8-week classes. They meet twice a month. They have anywhere from 100 to 200 pages of reading, depending on the level. And I'm basically trying to get people paid to teach. And the classes are cheap for our students. They're very affordable. We've cut out the middleman. It's a good gig. And the real thing is we record the classes and sell the archive to subscribers for $7 a month is our basic package. You get all the classes, and we've been growing rapidly with that. And basically that income allows me to subsidize the classes. The subscribers subsidize the classes, so I lose money. I pay the people that I hire more than the total tuition that the students get, and I make it back up on subscriptions. And so that model is growing rapidly. So I'm trying to create an intellectual space outside the university. We don't really need them that much, and and there actually is demand out there for people who want to learn. The university isn't serving their needs as students, and they're willing to pay for it. I mean, it's a class with us doesn't cost that much more than, it costs much less than going out to the bar for a night, right, in Los Angeles or something like that. So it's affordable. So
that's
great. The basic idea.
Yeah, I think that makes us comrades in some sense, because as folks know, through Acid Horizon and through Zer0 Books, we run Patreon reading groups. But seriously, what we do pales in the sophistication and the organization that you have. Would you mind getting into some of the details? Because Noah had told me that you do something quite interesting with allowing subscribers or students to pay into the system, but then they end up getting money back. What are some of the intricate economics of the way that you run the school?
So I think what Noah is referring to is the rebate. We offer a rebate model, basically. So to get into the money stuff a little bit, in some of my orientation towards money, when I first began thinking about economics in the aftermath of, I graduated from college in 2011 into the aftermath of, the great financial crisis and all that sort of stuff. And so I started becoming interested in it and turned to Marxism and studied Marxism pretty, I was very intensely carried away with it for several years. And in that tradition, one gets the idea that money, kind of corrupts things, that the best thing would be to get rid of money to escape from the logic of the money form or whatever. In my thinking now, I think that money is an interesting tool that you can play with, and there's a lot more contingency. It depends about how you structure how money flows. There isn't one logic of how money has to work. You can do different things with it. And one example of this is that, sometimes I've taught classes for free. I don't like doing free stuff because people stop coming. When I say I'm going to teach this class for free, people show up for the first session and then they don't come back to the second session, and it makes me feel bad. But if they pay, then they come back. In much higher rates, right? So there's something important, and sometimes I have difficulty explaining this to people on the left who are very resistant to it, for whom the ideal is escaping from anything that sounds like money. But so basically the way that our classes work is that students pay up front, and then I offer a rebate for every class that they attend at the end. And this gives them I'm trying to get people libidinally invested into the project of studying books, and the stuff, and what we do is difficult. It's not easy stuff all the time, and some of it's easier than others, but that gives them buy-in, right? I paid for this. It's valuable to me. Not only that, but if every class that I miss, it has a money value attached. That's $15 that I could have got back on my tuition, but I didn't do the reading and come to class, and so I can't. Now, what's funny about this is that my rate of having people claim the rebates is incredibly low. Almost nobody asks for them back. So people do sometimes claim the rebates, especially so it works as kind of a sliding scale. But generally, what I find is that people like the idea up front. And then by the time they got to the end of the class, they said, "Well, that was worth the money I paid for it. Like I support this project. Like I don't really need my money back." But anybody who if that's actually an important amount of money to somebody, then they'll ask for it back, and I'm happy to do that. So it lets me, my students have often very different abilities to pay. I mean, I have some older guys who are like lawyers and stuff for whom what I charge them is way too cheap. It should be more. And then I have people who are, early 20s, partially employed students, grad students, and things like this. So like Noah.
Great. This actually quite reminds me of when I was in college. I was the secretary of our judo club and our judo team. And I remember our coach saying to us, like, make sure you get the $40 from everybody, because otherwise people are going to stop showing up to this. And, to me, I was politically unaware at that time and just, didn't really have a good sense of, the libidinal investment, like you're saying, that people actually put into something if they make a real economic investment. But here's the challenge. As somebody who studied Marxism and maybe ostensibly, believed in the idea that at some point, if we're to achieve communism or surpass capitalism, we need to abolish the value form. I mean, is this an idea that you yourself have gotten beyond, or is there a way to use money within a context of a society that has somehow surpassed capitalism?
It's what you set up as a framework that makes very little sense to me now. Everything you just said would have made complete sense to me in my 20s. Now I barely even know what's being asked. I mean, as a historian of, my scholarly work is about the history of money. I work mainly on the 14th to kind of early 17th centuries English history is like mainly my main focus of my scholarship. And what you find is that modern economic thought, and it's derived from Hegel in large part. Hegel sets the foundational myth of much of this, although he's also drawing on thinkers like Adam Smith who are assembling this myth. So it doesn't spring fully formed from the head of Hegel, but he's maybe the central reference for how this myth works today. That's very much about how modernity founds itself by putting the medieval world into the past. So there's this positing of this rupture, right, of this epochal rupture, in which a number of things get asserted by contrast about the medieval past. For example, in what's called the German historical school, which is a little bit of a subterranean influence on the MMT literature. There's an idea, that the medieval past was more moral or more ethical than our world, right? This was before we were alienated. So the story that's being told is about the alienation that occurs under this thing we call capitalism. In order to explain how that can happen in history, we then need to posit that there's this past when people weren't alienated. Constructing this narrative involves saying a lot of things about the medieval past that turn out really to be sort of not true when you go read the literature. And so I see more as much continuity as I see rupture in this foundation of what we think of as the modern world. So the whole framework of saying, well, we're in capitalism and we used to not be, because it also matters for this story that the things that we associate with capitalism are really recent. Right. That and then you get development of ideas like late capitalism and all these other kinds of things. But then you start studying monetary history and they had futures contracts in the Bronze Age, So what and money itself is this very old thing, depending on what, it's not even clear how old it is because it depends on what you define, how you're looking for when you decide it began. But all of these things began to seem much more old to me. As I learned more about these topics, leading to one of my slogans that I like to tell my students is "same shit, different epoch." Right? I mean, there are problems that are theorized as being capitalism problems in the way that a lot of people think about them, which makes them tractable because they're then modern problems. They've only happened very recently. That in my view turn out to be much more deeply ancient problems. And I think taking that seriously helps us understand them better, but it disrupts some certain kinds of like optimistic eschatological narratives we might have about overcoming them and surpassing them. So I'm skeptical about the whole framework that you're setting up.
Yeah, I admit that my question was a bit of a setup. This makes me want to ask you about Deleuze and Guattari and the nomadology plateau and the apparatus of capture, but I'm going to put that on pause for a second and maybe pass it to Adam.
Well, yeah, I'm not going to crack open the Deleuze and Guattari aspect, but I do think it's really important to definitely sort of unpack some of these very German kinds of historiography that, I mean, this is stuff we even see being refuted by Jean-Francois Lyotard in The Biddle Economy, where it's like, it wasn't like we'd fallen from grace. And I think he actually picks stuff in Baudrillard where this ends up having actually sort of quite racist connotations of essentializing, free modern peoples from a standard modernists themselves pick up. And this is just gripping throughout Hegel. But rather than indulge my love of putting the knife into my old master, I do actually want to take it back to university a little bit and just talk about, because so I gave something of like a collaborative talk at the University of Essex's basically communization center cover. And I did, Colin, I did actually mention your model as a model of like one way we actually take the university outside the university. And I think it's good to think about this idea of changing the libidinal economy of learning. Because fundamentally, the libidinal economy of learning, at least in the UK, where I am, is based on a social mobility myth. That the university is a place that distributes grades, and grades are functionally a kind of currency insofar as they are like passcodes or like not even currency, only more like keys to get into certain aspects of the job markets. And that social mobility ideology is actually what ends up fucking a lot of us over, because guess what? If you don't go to Oxford and Cambridge, a lot of these aren't really as keen on having you in. As soon as grade inflation kicks in, the old doors of the aristocracy, because in Britain we never liquidated our aristocracy, we still need to get to that, but those doors really close in. And I was thinking about this particularly in line of some of the critiques of the university we've gotten in the last 10 years or so from people like Stefano Hani and Fred Moten, where they say the university is a place of fugitivity. It's a place you can take refuge. You can, as they say, the only proper relationship to university now is a criminal one. But it seems really as the forces of reaction, they're on the move, and university is getting so much more expensive, and the means of living around university get more expensive, that this fugitivity is drying up. So I guess, Colin, I'd like to ask, what do you think about this idea that is the university still a place of refuge? I mean, obviously it's going to be differ from place to place, but in your experience, has it been that? And does this mean we need to change the reason why we want to read these books in the first place, rather than for the promises of a failed social mobility?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'm very sick of hearing about Moten and Harney, and I'd be happy if I never had to hear about that again. I think it's something that made sense for a previous generation, and that doesn't make sense in the same way for us. Because I mean, for me, the university is not a refuge. If I were going to go to university, I would have to pay rent in the place where the university is, which is the opposite of. I mean, I ran away from the university so that I could get a house where I can afford to live, and I could get off the rent treadmill. And so the university is only a refuge if there's funds available for you there. I mean, it all comes down to funding. And, well, this is a topic that I tried to raise to Fred Moten and at one point. I've studied with him briefly, and there's not willing to talk in what to me is a serious and business-like manner about funding and money, right? I mean, there's a certain desire to tiptoe around these questions among people who want to perform a certain radical subjectivity inside of academia in a way that I've now come to see as kind of self-aggrandizing more than it is radical. I have nothing against stealing from the university if you're in a position to do so, but the question is, what about those of us who aren't in a position to do so? What do we do? And there's the further problem that, as much it would have been nice to get paid as a grad student enough to put a roof over my head and not have to find other external sources of funding. But the funding was not my only beef about the university and what was happening there. I mean, the bigger beef was that it's boring. I mean, there's people talk endlessly and they don't say very much, and it's boring, and they pretend to read things that they don't, and everybody's afraid to disagree with one another because the university is about it works on a status hierarchy, and everybody is intensely aware of the status hierarchy at all times. And it sits a little in tension with the belief that what we are doing at the university is enabling social mobility for our students. It seems to me rather that the university is an institution that is about inequality, that is about reproducing inequality. That is its purpose. And if we had institutions of intellectual life that weren't unequal, I think many of the academics wouldn't know what to do. They'd have to say something interesting that somebody wants to sit there and listen to, which is not something that they are necessarily very good at or interested in. So for me, it's not just if the university would just pay me enough, I would want to be there. I mean, I have other reasons for wanting to be outside the university. And at Mimbres School, we cultivate, I think, what is a refreshingly different attitude towards the study of text and the business of thinking than one might find at the university. And so it's kind of my bet that, not only can we fund the thing without the university, but what we're going to do is better. I mean, we're going to have more fun and be more interesting, and so it's not just a salvage or an escape or a fugitive, of being fugitive. I think we can do better. I think we deserve better from our intellectuals and from our academic life.
Great. Noah, do you want to hop in?
Yeah, I've been pushing for us to get together because I think there's a lot of overlap with sort of the Acid Horizon following and what the Mimbres project is about. I mean, we read Bataille and Deleuze and Guattari in two different reading groups right now, and we uncover a lot of problems about kinship and a lot of discussions about money and exchange and debt. And I've been trying to bring some of the Mimbres' view on money and kinship and assets and that connection to reading Bataille. And it becomes really useful to see the anthropological milieu he's discussing and he's having these conversations with, and his encounters with the economics. And maybe I wanted maybe to give you a chance to give your connecting puzzle of like the French theorists that we are so into, and the view on money that you have, because we've read Anti-Oedipus together, we've read a bit of Bataille together, and you mentioned that you were more indebted to them than you might have remembered when you first, since you've read it, right? And just your take on that, and maybe how why Acid Horizon should care about money, if we care about these other philosophers.
Okay, so I mean, Deleuze and Guattari are very influential on my thought. We did Anti-Oedipus, a seminar on that last year. I had a lot of fun reading it. I haven't read 1,000 Plateaus in 10 years. I mean, so the stuff they say about money in the Apparatus of Capture chapter and some of the later sections is very interesting, because they're working with the right kind of theory. So maybe I'll say something about what the right kind of theory is, and then y'all can fill in the. I'm not going to quote you Deleuze and Guattari from memory. I'm not going to try, right? But what they have in that chapter is a theory of money that doesn't try to reduce one of the axes of monetary phenomena to the other. And what I mean by that is that there's basically what we call a vertical axis and a horizontal axis in monetary systems. The debate about money in the mainstream is set up between chartalists and metallists. So this is intro stuff. I figure people know this, right? But basically the difference between these camps can be characterized by what they say about coins. Coins, of course, is the paradigmatic example of what you would think of when you think of money. Even when we think about money today, most people have a sense that it's paper when it should be something else. It should be a coin, and it isn't anymore, and that matters for some reason, right? People have this kind of sense. So we think about coins when we think about money. And the coin is a weird thing, because on the one hand, it's got precious metal in it, and on the other hand, it's got a sign on it. It's got a stamp. It's entered into a signifying system. It is a linguistically constructed artifact that has something to do with state power. And the different camps of monetary theory generally try to reduce one to the other. They either try to say what really matters is the metal, and this, for example, this is what Aristotle says. The state just kind of guarantees how much metal there is in the coin, and then we kind of know that the state could debase the money, but like that's bad because that's tyranny, right? That's basically the sort of conceptual framework. And then you have the other camp. This is a view that has a long history, but has come more into the fore in the 20th century because of the development of the modern monetary regime, the central banks, state-issued banknotes. And this is a theory that says basically, well, it's the stamp is the only thing that matters. And in fact, the metal is irrelevant. It's so Keynes calls it a barbarous relic. You get various writers like Christine Desan who try to explain away the metal. They try to, they could have made it out of anything, but they chose metal for kind of like some, it prevents counterfeiting is one argument they make, which makes no sense. Actually, there's no clear reason that it would do that. But but they're always trying to reduce one to the other. And what Deleuze and Guattari have, and I think they're influenced by certain writers in what was called like the French circuitist school. The French thinkers are a little ahead of the Anglophone thinkers in thinking about money, partly from the influence of Fernand Braudel, who's also a big influence on Deleuze and Guattari in the way that they're thinking about history. And they're trying to think about money without trying to reduce one to the other, to say, look, I mean, yes, there is a vertical system of monetary phenomena. And when we think about monetized societies, in terms of societies where you'd walk around with your money in your pocket and you buy a hot dog or whatever, right? I mean, where everyday interactions are mediated by money, generally this is a situation that seems to be produced by state formation processes, and particularly involving naval power. So states get navies and they monetize their societies kind of as a result of this. So there's like this crucially important aspect of, in particular, for reasons that are interesting to think about, naval power projection, and as stimulating a monetary economy. But it's not the case, as the Chartalists want to say, that that's the only thing that matters. That they have this theory where there's just this unquestioned sovereign who's the arbitrary boss of everybody, and he spends money into existence and taxes it back out of existence for reasons that are a little unclear why he would even want to. Like, what exactly problem does that solve? It's a little unclear. So my work follows from this kind of idea that Deleuze and Guattari have, where they're emphasizing the circuits of the towns. I mean, this is the horizontal axis. They're talking about these and they're getting this from Braudel. And then they have a theory of the state framed in terms of overcoding, So there are these flows that are happening, and the state is taking these flows as its raw materials and inserting its own significance production, right, into these flows, and trying to overcode them and harness them to its own purposes. But that it's this continually incomplete process, right? There's this constitutive and fundamental tension between the two different aspects of the phenomena. And this is a view that is totally consonant with what I would take to be the correct view about money. Now, the question is, what does this have to do with kinship and all of this kind of stuff? Which I can go on, but maybe I'll pause for a moment.
Oh, actually, I would like you to say a little bit more about that. And I'll just say that, one of the ways that I'm thinking about Deleuze and Guattari's work here that might help us is and you're talking about how Deleuze, I'm thinking of his essay, Two Regimes of Madness, where he talks about different regimes of money. I mean, in very simple terms, the change that I have in my pocket to buy the hot dog versus financial capital. And I guess my question would be, how do we think about kinship in terms of this other axis or this other regime of capital, which is financial capital, that at the macro level, can impact, the kinds of experiments that, both you and I and all of us here are trying to undertake to build, a new framework, a new paradigm for education, when the vagaries of financial capital are so volatile that it could, in a fell swoop, kind of reduce us to, a situation where we can't carry on with these experiments anymore. And I wonder if you have a sort of political view that backs that up. Like, how do we approach the issue of financial capital as it relates to our individual and collective freedom?
Mm-hmm. So I think the issue here, and this is what my work is most centrally concerned with, is that there is really kind of in the middle of and in the aftermath of the English 17th century, which was of course a very eventful year for the English. I mean, a very eventful century for the English. They chopped off the head of their king. They experimented with parliamentary rule. They eventually the London commercial classes that supported the Commonwealth eventually kind of turned on it, and they invited the king back. There's the Restoration, and then there's the Glorious Revolution, and in the wake of the Glorious Revolution, we have the founding of the Bank of England, which is the foundation of the modern monetary regime. So my critique of the Chartalists is to say that they're anachronistically projecting actually much more modern development onto the past and saying this is how it always worked. I'm saying, well, it's not how it always worked, and in fact, people in the past knew that you could have modern money, but they thought it would be a terrible idea. I mean, they didn't want that to happen. Developing a political constitution that made it possible was a process that occurred through an immense amount of bloodshed in the English 17th century. And the American Civil War is in some ways a continuation of these kind of struggles, right? The dollar system was really born out of the American Civil War. And so what I try to do is call attention to the ways that monetary systems require certain kinds of constitutions. Money poses a threat to constitutional order, and it also depends upon the maintenance of constitutional order. And we need to understand that. So this leads up to your question, because what happened in the development of the modern state constitution was the development of a new kind of relationship between finance and the state. Where essentially, what happens is that the kind of Anglo-Dutch commercial elite develop an alliance with the English state apparatus in such a way that allows the state's debt to become a safe asset. And this is really important. It can't be taken for granted. So this is central to not only MMT, but to modern financial portfolio theory. So basically, modern portfolio theory assumes that there's this risk-free rate of return, and that there's this asset, which is like the U.S. debt, that's kind of pretty close to being the risk-free rate of return. But the idea that debt owed to you by a sovereign would be risk-free is actually extremely counterintuitive, because he's the sovereign. So if he decides not to pay you, what are you going to do about it? I mean, so traditionally, sovereign debt is a risk asset and not a safety asset. For example, if you read about Philip II, the King of Spain, who famously made this alliance with the Genoese merchant bankers and this kind of stuff. I mean, his debt was a risk asset. They made money lending to him, despite the fact that he defaulted on it a number of times, until eventually they got wiped out. But for a good period of time, the investors were making a lot of money because it was a risk asset. Now, what the English develop, and this is eventually how they defeat Napoleon, is by making public debt safe. Now, what that allows to happen is for public debt to be at the center of the creation of near money in the private sector, right? So there's an important concept, the idea of liquidity, that I develop in some detail in the first chapter of my dissertation. The short version of it, right, is that you can't just expect that a market is going to exist and is going to let you transact however you want to at any time, right? So you couldn't necessarily just walk into a market and sell something and then go, oops, I didn't want to sell it, and then buy it back immediately at the same price. You're gonna have to buy it back for higher than you sold it for. In the market, there exists a spread for any kind of asset that's being priced, and the less liquid the asset is, the bigger the spread is going to be. So very liquid assets have very tight spreads. So that's what makes money different than everything else, is it's very liquid. So you can transact in it without losing a lot of value, I suppose, by doing it, right? So when you price assets, you're essentially pricing how liquid they are relative to money. And having a large market in public liabilities and public debt allows everything else, all other kinds of assets, to be priced with reference to that kind of asset, right? So we can tell how close to money they are, and we can price the difference between that asset and money. What this effectively does, this is what repo markets do, for example. What this does is allow other things that aren't money to be turned into money, to be turned into synthetic money. Because what you do is you hedge the difference between that asset and money, and now what's left over is money, right? So this is a constitutional order in which capital asset markets, right, the capitalized value of non-money assets is stabilized and guaranteed by the operation of state power, that has taken on a kind of constitutional responsibility to ensure the liquidity of non-monetary assets. And this is important to understand, because most of the money in the economy is not produced by the state. Rather, it's near money. It's money that is just a little bit less liquid than the official state money, and this is where most of the money comes from. And so there is a public-private partnership that has been developed over the constitutional history of the last, say, 300 years of the Anglo-American dominated world order, in terms of in which the sovereign power makes itself safe by becoming less risky for capital asset markets. That is a problem that we need to rethink if we're going to rethink, the relationship between the state and distributional justice, because there's important ways that becoming safe for capital asset markets requires states to take distributional justice off the table, right? So this is the question that NNT raises, which is, okay, I mean, we all sat there in 2008 and we go, well, the state can just print money out of nothing in order to save the banks. Like, why can't it print money out of nothing in order to like do stuff for us, like buy us housing or fight climate change or whatever? Whereas the people that I'm critiquing tend to see this as a sort of a contingent accident. We could just fix this. I'm saying it's not an accident. It's a feature of constitutional order. And if Anglo-American elites had thought that were going to happen, they would never have permitted the monetary system that we have to be developed in the first place. And the legacy of this is really a kind of an unspoken and perhaps unspeakable understanding among the elites that money is non-scarce in a state of emergency when capital is threatened, and scarce at all other times when there's just the normal amount of misery and inequality in our societies. And that this distinction can't just be wished away by progressive legal scholars who want to recover the history of money in order to say, well, we could all have nice things because money is ontologically non-scarce. I mean, sure, but you might have to fight another civil war if you want to create a constitution that's going to make that happen. So my work is concerned to understand that history and understand how it's not an accident that there are these kind of seeming paradoxes in the way, because the people who constructed these systems were well aware of the problem, which is that if you remove money from this foreign exchange discipline, from the gold standard or whatever, well, why doesn't the bank just help everybody? This is what Walter Bagehot says in his book, A Description of Lombard Street, which I recommend everybody to read, who's a central thinker in the development of constitutional thought around the central bank regime. And the main question he's concerned with is that. He wants to say, look, the central bank's got to help the asset markets. It's got to be the lender of last resort. But we need to create a firewall so that this non-scarcity of money that exists in this sovereign institution doesn't eliminate inequality in society. Because if the bank eliminates inequality, elites have no buy-in to reproducing the social order. That's what they want from the social order, is to remain being elites. And so part of what I try to show in my work is that this problem is a deep history, and it in some ways has always been the problem about coinage systems, the politics of coinage and debasement and these kinds of things have always circled around this issue. And so this gets to the problem of kinship, because the point is, the state, modern Europeans developed a fiction according to which the state serves the people, and the people are sovereign, and the people are kind of this undifferentiated mass of equal abstract citizens. But of course, this is not really how it works. Really how it works is that the state is a vehicle for the reproduction of elite families. Elite families with generational wealth, and the state is committed to defending the reproduction of generational wealth. And for this reason, it takes the question of distributional justice off the table in the way that it constructs the monetary system. And so my opponents, I would call them, say that they sort of suggest that if we just avoid talking about these things, then progressive policymakers can get in power and then they'll fix it. My view is that we need to talk about these things, and that there's deep issues about the legitimacy narratives of the state, and the way that those legitimacy narratives require constructing metaphysical frameworks according to which certain things appear to be impossible. And the value theory is actually one such metaphysical framework, which is that essentially value is sort of some metaphysical force that constrains the distributional power of the state to sort of just tax and spend and reconfigure society however it wants. This is what I'm working on right now, is kind of the genealogy of the value theory from William Petty through David Ricardo before Marx. Anyway, I've said a lot, so.
No, that's great. I do have a question, but I'll give it up to Adam if you want to go first.
Okay.
Well, it's a great time to be doing this episode, given we have the sovereign of the UK. Just about to have his. He's already had his face stamped on the fucking coins, to be honest. But just thinking about specifically the city of London. Craig, when you came over to the UK and I described to you what the city of London is, when you describe the city of London is to anyone who's not from London, they do tend to think you are a bit insane. So yeah, there's a pseudo-democratic state institution which precedes England itself, which has more or less been left alone since William the Conqueror in 1066. Is responsible for a lot of the colonization of islands, and has a specific deal with the government that there's, for example, in Parliament, there's a guy called the Remembrancer who has to remind Parliament of his debts to the city. Freedom of information requests don't work on the city. 9 times out of 10, different police force. The king can't technically go in there without permission, has a separate mayor, and all of the democratic functionaries are predominantly voted on by the people, the companies that work there. And it is actually, there's this sovereign paradox of why is the sovereign's debt something which they can actually gamble on? And thinking about the reproduction of aristocracy, and I think it's particularly interesting, maybe it's not, I don't know how universalizable it is from England, because not to go full Neanderthal, but we didn't really have like this, big land reforms. We didn't dissolve the gentry. We didn't have these French rollings of heads which would destroy the European aristocracy, or even the kinds of great redistributions that would happen in throughout the 30 Years' War across the continental Europe. But I guess the question specifically about the idea of the political aspect of this is that under such conception, then, Colin, is the theory of capital in terms of a value form Marxism? Of course, it's one sort of form of Marxism, but it seems actually to be returning to one of the definitions of capital Marx gives, which really isn't picked up very much in sort of discussions, which is command over unpaid labor. So in this sense, does the definition of capital really become more about purchasing power than reproducing an abstract equivalence?
Yeah. So, give you a preview of what I'm working on. There's going to be a couple of long posts. So, I got sent down this rabbit hole because I was beefing with William Clare Roberts on Twitter about what Capital by Karl Marx says and doesn't say. And I'm reviewing his book, but in the middle of reviewing it, I started the value theory stuff. I was like, okay, I got to figure out where this comes from once and for all, and all this kind of stuff. So I've gone back to William Petty, who's a thinker maybe many people don't know as much about, but the story is that he is the originator of this labor theory of value. As it turns out, he's not. I actually think he's being totally misread, and that Petty has what most people think is a later theory, which is return on capital. Basically the equalization of the rate of profit, which plays an important role in Marx's system. This is actually the argument that Petty is making, not a labor theory of value. I believe, so there's, to make a long story short, there are two very different ideas of the labor value concept that are in tension in Smith. And what I'm going to be suggesting in the new chapter of my book is that Marx takes these two, he sees this contradiction, and because he's an earnest German schoolboy, he says, aha, these two different labor theory concepts are the first two terms of a Hegelian dialectic, and I'm gonna take these things and I'm gonna turn on the Hegel machine, and I'm gonna do capital with it, right? So the two concepts are what the literature on Adam Smith calls the labor commanded theory of value and the labor embodied theory of value, and they're different. Okay, so basically, starting with William Petty, and William Petty. So I'm going to resist talking at great length about William Petty, who's kind of my obsession at the moment. But they, after the Restoration, after the City of London basically gives up on the Commonwealth, they invite Charles II back, and now they got to fix the taxation because taxes was what they were fighting over. And the old medieval tax was the subsidy. It's basically tax on movable goods. So they just come and say, okay, you got some wine, you got some grain, you got some whatever. We'll take 1/10 of it or 1/15 of it, depending on whether you're in the city or the country or whatever. So the problem is that basically this system was falling apart already in the 16th century during the Tudor period. It basically was obsolete, and they can't revive it. And so they are left with the Commonwealth fiscal system, which is based on assessments. So it's called the monthly assessment. And basically what it is they just rate each county. So each county just has a certain, they're like, well, this county is worth this much, this county is worth this much. And they push the responsibility for auditing everybody onto the counties. This raises the question about how to theorize capitalized value. So there's a difference between saying, I'm going to take X percentage of your produce of the land every year versus saying, I'm going to tax you based on the value of the land. There's a difference between the value of what the land produces in a given year and the value of the land itself. The difference between those is what we call the capitalization rate. How many years worth of produce does it cost to buy the land in the first place? That's what you do when you buy an asset. So Petty is trying to develop a theory of capitalization. I mean by capitalization just that and nothing more, right? How do you price a revenue generating asset in terms of its price on the market now? How much is it worth now? And for that, you need a theory of like time horizons and discounting and other kinds of things like this. Petty is doing this because he basically thinks that the problem is disproportionate taxation. When you tax people disproportionately, they get mad and then you have a civil war. But if you can figure out exactly what everybody's property is worth and tax them all perfectly proportionately, then they won't care. They'll be totally happy to pay the taxes because it doesn't matter, because basically they could be taxed infinitely. This is basically what he says. If only you could find the proportional assessment of their wealth. And so this raises the question, which in many ways is the foundational question of political economy, which is what's the par? What's the par value between land and labor? By which they meant not what we think of as labor, but returns on capital. They meant, so when the 17th century writers say, when a man digs silver out of the ground, they don't mean the man himself, they mean his workers, right? So the returns to labor really means the returns to entrepreneurial capital. That's what they're talking about, even though they call it labor. So like, just look at the famous passage of John Locke where he's proposing this labor theory. He says, the turf my horse has, and then he says the tin my servant has digged, right? So this labor theory from its very origin was really actually about capital. Anyway, so they're trying to, okay, so we need this par. How do we value land and labor against one another as capitalized assets? In the French tradition, Richard Cantillon, he's the one who develops, I think, this labor embodied theory of value, but he's really developing it as a land embodied theory of value, not a labor embodied theory of value. This is what people think of when you think of physiocrats, right? The idea that ultimately the land produces value, and then there's kind of this substance that's produced in the land, and then it's transmogrified into other things. This is the idea of a conservation law of a value substance that is being preserved across its transformation from one sector into another. Petty doesn't have that idea. Cantillon has that idea. And they're a little bit different, right? One of them asks, suppose we have this revenue thing, or so we have this commodity, how much value, how much labor are the direct and indirect inputs of producing it? That's this labor embodied theory. But then we say, okay, so now I sell that thing, and how much labor can I command by selling it? That's the labor commanded theory of value. Smith uses one in one place and one in the other place, depending on how it suits his purposes at the moment. But what I'm suggesting, and I'm going to be suggesting this at length in forthcoming work, is that Marx says, look, I mean, this is one is value in itself, and the other one is value for another, and there's a contradiction between them. And given that, I can boot up the Hegelian dialectic, and I can say, well, what happens? If value in and for itself produces a contradiction, then we've got this motor that we can use in order to try to do stuff like the way that I learned from Hegel. So my take on this ultimately is that the value concept, which now is this shibboleth of Marxists, I mean, it's this thing that you have to say you believe in, even though nobody knows what exactly it means. They have all these, theological arguments over it. Really, I mean, this is a concept that's developed by English elites in the 17th and 18th century, mainly about the tax base. It's a theory of the tax base. So, I mean, really what they're asking is, how do we have a theory about how much there is to tax? Or later in Ricardo is saying, well, we have this English public debt. What backs the debt? I mean, it seems like it's this unbacked floating debt. What backs it? Well, value backs it, right? So the debt is safe because it's got value backing it, or something like this. But so I think that we're actually, as socialists, communists, leftists, whatever, we're actually better off just abandoning this concept entirely. It provides a legitimacy narrative that people are very attached to, right? The labor produces all value, et cetera, and so forth. But the problem is that it obscures the operation of money and financial power, because that is kind of one of the things that it was created to do. And so when we mistake that framework for a theory of the world, we miss important things about how financial power works, and my view is they're better off basically just not even talking about value. I mean, there really is no such thing. There are prices. Prices are made in the market. We should understand how prices work, rather than claiming to have a theory that lets us see beyond prices to what really matters, even though we've given up on the project of having a quantitative theory about it, which is really what value form stuff is. It says, well, it's just about the form. It's not about actually having a theory that quantifies all of this stuff or makes predictions or any kinds of things like this. So I think it's a trap. I think the value theory is a trap in that what we need instead is the concept that for me is the master concept that replaces value, of course, is options. I mean, there isn't value because there's options, and we'd be better off understanding the logic of options, which relates to sovereignty, right? So even in Bataille, I'll bring it into Bataille. I mean, Bataille is interested in sovereignty as the option to waste, right? The option to waste unproductively for no reason as a condition of possibility of the economy in general, right? So this is important because I think it tells us something really interesting about the somewhat contradictory role of the state in, well, wasting money so that others can have it to use it for. And in a way, I mean, much of what I'm talking about when I talk about the development of the modern constitutional order, is the attempt to tame the sovereignty of the sovereign. In order, the sovereign needs to be there, but we're going to keep him locked up in the tower and trot him out when we need him, and all this other kinds of stuff. And potentially, I mean, what we would want to reclaim in order to intervene into this order is a valorization of sovereign waste. I mean, we do want the sovereign to do a bit of wasting, and the question is exactly how to think about that. So I hope that kind of makes sense.
It's unrelated note. The coronation is expected to cost £100 million.
This is the colonization.
The
coronation. Yes,
colonization will cost far much more.
Yeah, yeah. So all of these thinkers, I mean, when they believe both at once that the crown is spending too much money, but that it needs to spend a lot of money. They're always saying we're not saying that the king shouldn't lived in style, and they always say, well, because when the king, has all this fancy shit, well, basically, it creates jobs. He's the job creator and all of this. And they're trying to emphasize that the money that leaves the king's coffers goes into the rest of the economy. So they're trying to think about this circuit, and the king is occupying a particular place in the circuit where he needs to spend a lot of money. Otherwise, it stops working, right? I mean, if the king hoards all the money, then there's no money, and so you need him to spend. But how do you both get him spending but restrain him from, for example, abolishing all the debts or stiffing all of his creditors and all this kind? I mean, it's a tricky situation. Go ahead.
I was gonna, as we're getting to the hour mark, wanted to kind of shed some light on what specific courses we've been doing, what we're going to do this summer and in the fall. I mean, when your goal was to start answering questions or asking questions about money, but we suddenly started discussing theology and anthropology in these courses, and political theology, French theorists, historians of all kinds. Is it all about the money? Are there what is the connecting thread for Mimbres, et cetera?
Yeah, it is all about the money. Although I tried to let it be about something different, but it keeps coming. The money keeps coming back. Yeah, I mean, much of what I've talked about today, I haven't used that word, but there are what are called theodicy structures. So I assume you all know what this means. I mean, it's the justification of evil. So you need if God made the world and God is all powerful and all good, why is there evil, et cetera, and so forth. This is the basic structure of legitimacy narratives. I would go so far as to suggest that economics itself is a theodicy and nothing else. I mean, economics is a theodicy, and it needs to be understood as that. Otherwise, you don't understand what it is you're looking at. So we, in our courses, we explore a variety of things that in many ways touch on money, but I try to let the metonymy take us where it goes and not try to impose my conceptual metaphors on everything ahead of time. Really, the curriculum is partly determined by people who show up into our seminars. And I mean, the best way to get hired at Mimbres School is take a class at Mimbres School and do the reading and be interesting and be a good participant. And so, when people show up and they know about stuff, they have passions about stuff, I give them a class. So we're doing a class this summer on the history of horses from the domestication of horses, their use in military structures, all these kinds of, it's a class on nomadism, I suppose. Really, I mean, for basically no other reason than Joy has been in the seminar and she's super pumped about horses, and I love learning from people who are very excited to teach us about what they know. So this summer, it's probably a little. My classes are pretty full anyway, but we got there's a course on Black Studies. So a lot of what we've been talking about does lead into questions about race. There's the German idealism angle, and the other, so when I say the constitutional order is about protecting intergenerational wealth and intergenerational inequality, obviously, at least in the United States, and I think in much of the world, we're talking about race when we talk about that. So this is something that we're trying to understand better. And I'm giving a course on Hobbes's Leviathan this summer. And in the fall, we have a course on the French Revolution and the Revolution of 1848. So kind of the 19th century revolutions. We have, what else is it? Jade is teaching human origins. So we're going to be looking at the evolution of humans, kind of biological anthropology kind of material. And there is one other class that is escaping my memory at the moment. But if you want to find out, you can tweet at me. My handle is there. And you can sign up on Patreon for $7 a month to see everything that we're up to.
Yeah, and just one thing that I'm particularly excited for, which is going to be next year, is there's going to be a course on the history of damnation, and looking at the words damnation and redemption in the context of theological conversations and how that's connected to economic reform or policy and things like that. So there's a lot of things that we're doing that are very fascinating. Yeah.
Damnation, and I'm giving the class on sovereignty. So we're going to start with Plato's Statesman and consider the political theological problem as the problem of the decision over the exception from Plato to Schmidt, Kantorowicz, Bataille, 20th century thinkers like that. So maybe y'all should show up and read with us. I'd love to have you.
Well, great, Colin. Thank you very much for coming on the show. I am going to put all the stuff down there, as you said, and that'll be a link to your Twitter and other resources. So maybe the next time that we have you back on, we can talk about the provocative tweet that you put out there, which said the reason that we should study Hegel and Kant is to understand the way that racism works.
Yes.
But I don't think we should open that up. Otherwise, we're going to be here for another 40 minutes.
We don't have time. We don't have time for that topic. But
Go follow Colin. Also, go read Acid Horizon's book, because you're not going to believe it. That's something I actually spend a lot of time arguing.
Very good.
Chapter 3 is partially just using Cedric Robinson to show the epistemological gesture of Hegel. But one final question. So, gathering everything we've actually done today, just really quick one. Do we mint a $1 trillion coin? Do we do the coin?
Yeah, it'd be funny. I mean,
fuck yes.
I mean,
we have the official coin line.
But nobody. It doesn't matter what I think. I mean, it's not going to happen. They're not going to do it because what it would they'd have to invent a whole new story about why they can't do it again and all that. I mean, so I say not even one. I mean, you should mint everybody $1 trillion coin and pass them out on the street. I mean, just start throwing them out. Why not?
Mint the coin. Mint the coin. Right.
Yeah, mint them.
We appreciate your support of the imprint and the channel. Subscribe to Zer0 Books today on Patreon. Your material support helps us to promote a variety of perspectives on the left. Also, discover the many titles, new and old, that Zer0 has curated. Navigate to any of the links in the show notes to extend your support.